Hi, my name is Melchior, and I'd like to take a moment to explain how I'm currently thinking about the teachingopensource.org community. A few disclaimers: I'm only speaking for me, not for my employer, all that stuff. I am also completely randomly brain dumping here, so my handwriting may not be legible and my thoughts may not be particularly well thought out. That having been said, let's get started. So, the teaching open source community, the thesis that I'm going to put forth here is that this community is all about teaching open source community participation to students in existing academic institutions. And so, by way of doing that, we released quote-unquote academic source. What does it mean to do teaching the open source way? What does it mean to make learning experiences reproducible and transferable? And it means that we can ship the things that people usually use to transmit that kind of knowledge, which is curriculums, and you could think of putting them all together into a course catalog of packages of curricula that can be readapted and redeployed in different schools, different years, for different students and different disciplines. In order to support the production of that sort of, I'm going to call it a course catalog here, we have gatherings, funds, and infrastructure, and we have the POSSE, Professors Open Source Summer Experience Workshop, as an on-ramp to get people able to participate in teaching open source community participation. So we'll come back to each of these 3 points in turn and explain how they're working more. So it is important to realize that this practice of teaching community participation, when we talk about transmitting and distributing that, unlike transmission of software, we're not copying bits. This is something that's passed on from person to person, and it's never going to be a perfect copy because you learn teaching from people. And so you learn teaching as an apprenticeship by watching the people who teach you, and you learn it from a lot of in-person visits. That's why you have a lot of conferences, a lot of gatherings, a lot of just people being in touch with each other. And unlike software, where you try to get code from computer to computer, the endpoints, it's human to human. And any tools we make, any writing we produce, any software we write, including things like our course catalog and our curriculum, all of these things are not our primary objective. All of these things are artifacts that support our ability to teach each other the teaching of participation. That's the practice that we're trying to spread. Just as open source projects are more than the products they produce, teaching open source does not just produce a course catalog. It's a community of practice that produces a course catalog. But I'm going to talk about this course catalog as something that can be sort of the central focus of the teaching open source community, just as a Linux distribution or an application, and that software becomes the point of focus for the community's practice of that project. Also, it's important to talk about what teaching open source is not. Although we have people who come from teaching institutions and who do research at them, teaching open source is not a teaching institution. We do not run classes. You cannot attend teaching open source instead of going to school. We do not run research projects, although we may support and encourage research on the work we're doing, and we may collaborate on research in the shared teaching open source space. Teaching open source does not fundamentally produce research. We're not a software project, although we work with many open source software projects. We're not a company, although we work with companies and nonprofits. And we're not a professional organization like the ACM or the IEEE or the ASEE or any of those things. All of these things are the kinds of institutions that members of teaching open source are already members of, and they already exist. They do the job perfectly well, and what we want to do is use all these different kinds of things as tools that we can use in order to accomplish our goal of teaching open source community participation. So, talking a bit specifically about how we do this now. Let's focus in on schools, because ultimately we're trying to get this participation taught in schools. We're going to assume that schools are, in a sense, to the teaching open source community, private spaces. They're going to be a little bit black boxy. We're not going to be able to attend every department meeting or see the rationale behind every single curriculum revision. Schools have been running themselves for hundreds and hundreds of years. People teach within them. You know how to navigate the peculiarities of your particular school. That's cool. We don't need to have access to all of that, and we're probably not going to. Where we do have access to that is when we gather at academic conferences, open source conferences, hang out, getting together. These things are public spaces. These are things that the academic community does treat as ways to share and disseminate information. And so we're able to see that there. And then when we go to each of these events, we can report them back to the mailing list so the broader teaching open source community is aware of the work we're doing at our individual institutions. So as we go about gathering here and meeting new people, we're going to need to find ways to bring other people into the teaching open source community if they get excited about what we're doing and they want to help. So one entryway is POSSE, the Professor's Open Source Summer Experience, which is a one-week workshop that introduces professors to the concept of how open source communities work and how they can adapt the way the curriculum and the tools they use and the projects that they have their students do in order to get them to be involved in open source projects. And POSSE is an option for entering the teaching open source community. It is not the only way. We have plenty of great people in the teaching open source community who are not POSSE alumni, but if folks want to get started and they don't know how, POSSE is sort of the answer we can give them. Also, once they get started in POSSE and they're teaching classes at their schools, they may want to set up some tools for the students to use. For instance, a Planet blog aggregator, or an IRC or some other real-time chat channel so that remote people from open source communities can engage with their students. Teaching open source can provide infrastructure to support this, or for people who want to roll their own infrastructure in-house, we can provide mentorship and help your IT department or your department or you get that kind of stuff up and running. And all this infrastructure is to support classes that would go into the course catalog at Teaching Open Source. The criteria for membership in that catalog would be, does your class in some way teach open source community participation? It doesn't need to be the focus of your class, just like communication skills may not be the focus of a class, but if you have your students write essays, that's something that they're learning along the way as a learning objective. And a couple things it does not mean is that enrollment to your class doesn't need to be open to everybody. And this goes back to saying teaching open source is not a teaching institution. If only enrolled second-year students in your computer science program or your graphic design program can sign up for your class and there's a cap of 15, that's okay. But there needs to be a way from open source communities who are open to everybody else to participate, to be able to engage with your students and participate in some kind of learning experience in collaboration with them. So those are the requirements for being part of the course catalog. And as we put things into the course catalog, we're going to find that a lot of the resources we use to try and teach each other how to replicate the kinds of work we're doing, a lot of it's going to be redundant. Everyone's going to have to teach their students about blogging, everyone's going to have to teach their students about IRC and so forth. And so those kinds of shared resources that come up over and over again, it's almost like having common libraries on your computer that many programs use. And so when we compile them, they go into the Teaching Open Source textbook. And that's where the textbook comes in as a shared resource for the community at large. We also have grants to support all of this, travel, the infrastructure, all this collaboration. And so sort of the open question in my mind now is, what value does this create for all the participants in teaching open source, and How can it be tapped by professors, by students, by companies, by projects? Why are we here? Why is this entire giant mess, picture, whatever you call this, worth it to us to participate in? And that's a question I'm curious to hear the answer from a lot of different angles. That's all I had to say. As a reminder, this was a random brain dump, so coherence was not guaranteed. And I would very much like to hear any kind of thoughts and feedback and pushback, especially from folks who disagree with what I'm saying here. And please send it to the teachingopensource.org mailing list, and thank you very much for listening.